What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. And of course, welcome to 2025. Yes, Happy New Year. I hope you all had a fantastic holiday season. I hope you had a Merry Christmas if you celebrate. I hope you had a safe New Year's Eve and a Happy New Year, just the whole shebang. I don't want to brag, but I got bronchitis during my holiday break, so thanks for asking. I know. I was the chosen one this year, but maybe next year will be your year. Try not to be too envious. Real talk though, second time I've had bronchitis in my life, and 10 out of 10. I would not recommend. Shit sucks. Anyway, if this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos, I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If the combination isn't for you, I've got some links for you down in the description, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. All right, so it was just after 8:30 p.m. on January 27th, 2008, when a frantic call came in to the Bridgewater Police Department, located just about 45 minutes west of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. The call was placed by a young mother named Penny Boudreau, and devastatingly, she was calling to report her 12-year-old daughter, Karissa, missing. Based on the story that Penny initially gave police, it seemed as though Karissa might have run away while Penny was shopping at a local grocery store. However, as public interest grew and the investigation into Karissa's disappearance deepened, people quickly began to fear not only that Karissa had potentially met with foul play, but let's just say that people began to fear that the culprit might be a little too close for comfort. This is the story of the devastating disappearance and murder of 12-year-old Karissa Boudreau. This story was a request from a sweet subscriber named Kate, so thank you so much to Kate for making this video possible, and without further ado, this is Karissa's story. All right, so as I mentioned in the intro, we are in Nova Scotia today. So once again, we're trekking up to the Great White North.
Oh, Canada.
Specifically today, we're headed to a quaint little town in Nova Scotia called Bridgewater. With a population of just shy of 9,000 people today, Bridgewater sits on a little less than 5.5 square miles of land and is located in Lunenburg County. Overall, from what I could find, it seems like Bridgewater is most well known for its shopping, its festivals, its museums, and its parks. However, my guess is that the people who call this town home probably appreciate it the most for its safety and its security. Bridgewater, again, from what I could find, truly does seem very much like the quintessential small town, everyone knows everyone place where people live for generations and generations. And you know, I will tell you what, my friends, the more of these videos I do and the more of these stories I research, the more those things are morphing in my mind from selling points to red flags. Because I will be damned if the vast majority of these stories do not start off in these safe, quaint little neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone. You know, we're conditioned to view those things as positive, but I'm starting to think that if you're looking to move and someone describes a place like that to you, maybe you should turn around and look elsewhere. And that's not Bridgewater specifically. I'm just speaking generally. These cases always seem to happen in the places that you would least expect them to. Nevertheless, though, while Bridgewater is where the bulk of our story does take place today, before we can actually get into all of that, we first have to take a little trip over to Nova Scotia's western coast to good old Yarmouth County, where Karissa first made her debut. Karissa Paige Boudreau was born on October 4th, 1995, to her parents Penny Daw and Paul Boudreau. Karissa would ultimately be the only child born to Penny and Paul, and that was actually due to the fact that before Karissa was even born, Penny had broken things off with Paul in search of a relationship with his younger brother, Shane. Yeah, girl, straight out the womb, things for Karissa were, we'll say, unconventional. Let's just leave it at that. Paul and Penny met, if I'm going off of conception and gestation and such, I think they got together like sometime in either late 1994 or very early 1995. The two first met when they were working together at a local Sobeys grocery store. They met, They hit it off, and within just a couple of weeks, Penny found out that she was going to be having Paul's baby. And while that news would likely be hard on most, if not all, barely established couples, this was made exceptionally harder on Penny and Paul when Penny met Paul's brother and decided that she'd rather have him. So she and Paul broke up, and while she was, I think, like 4 months pregnant with his baby, she immediately rebounded and started seriously dating his little brother, as in her unborn baby's uncle. I mean, it's definitely weird. I don't think I'm alone in thinking that, but for what it's worth, they did stay together for quite a while. They stayed together all through Penny's pregnancy and well after Carissa's birth, but I'll get to that in a minute. Point being, Karissa had, like I said, an unconventional family dynamic. Her parents weren't together. Her mom was dating her uncle, and by the time she was 5, her mother had married her uncle. To clarify, nothing was wrong with Shane. Overall, he actually seems like a great guy. He was loving towards Karissa. He basically treated her like she was his own from the time she was born. So I don't mean to imply that his relationship with Penny was inherently negative. I just personally think the way that it started was a little messy. But, by this point, we're years out from that. Penny and Shane are married now, and Shane was doing all that he could to provide both Penny and Karissa with the best life that he possibly could. They had a nice house in Bridgewater, they had a big backyard, Karissa was active in her church, and she seemed to have a lot of good friends. I mean, for being born into a potentially toxic mess, initially, things for Karissa seemed like they were going decently well. That is, right up until Karissa was about to enter her preteen years, when Shane and Penny decided to get divorced. And in doing so, it appears as though everything about Carissa's life from that point forward was completely and totally flipped upside down on its head. I mean, the divorce in and of itself was really hard for Karissa because Shane might not have been her biological father, but he had been the main father figure in her life literally every single day since she was born. And that's not to say that Paul wasn't there, because he absolutely was. It was just Karissa lived with Shane. So not only was she losing that, but she had to move out of the house she loved. I think she might have had to change schools, if I'm not mistaken. Like, this divorce was basically a complete overhaul on Carissa's life, and it wasn't even one that she'd asked for. Ultimately, following the divorce, Karissa opted to move in with her father, Paul, and his new wife for a while Penny got herself back on her feet following the divorce. However, within a pretty short period of time, like 4, maybe 5 months, Karissa began to miss her life in Bridgewater. Sure, Bridgewater was small, but Shelburne, where Paul lived, well, it was even smaller. Shelburne was so small that, as far as Karissa was concerned, it made Bridgewater look like a metropolitan oasis. Not to mention that, living over an hour away from Penny now, Karissa started to miss regularly seeing her mom, which, to be fair, I think would be fairly typical for most adolescent girls. The problem, though, was that if Karissa wanted to move back home with Penny, she wasn't just going to be moving in with her mother. Rather, she would also be moving in with her mother's new boyfriend, Vernon McCumber, and this would be in an apartment, no less. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with apartment living, not at all. I'm just saying that all of these things combined made it to where this wasn't exactly an easy or seamless transition for anyone involved. Penny and Vernon were in a fairly new relationship. Karissa didn't know this man. Now they're all going to be crammed together, living on top of one another in this tiny little apartment. I mean, suffice it to say, tensions, they were high. According to the reporting that I saw, once Karissa had moved back in, it seems like she and Penny fought pretty much constantly. Now, as a former preteen girl, I can tell you that butting heads with your mom, it's almost like a rite of passage as a tween or teen. But even so, apparently the fights that went down between Penny and Karissa, well, they were just, I guess, like next level. In fact, it got so bad so frequently that Vernon, on multiple occasions, told Penny that something between the two of them had to give. Like, she had to figure out something, some way to find common ground with her daughter. Because he simply could not keep coming back home to these blowout, knockdown, drag-out screaming matches. And so, seemingly taking his advice, Penny soon decided that she and her daughter needed a good old-fashioned drive around town, a bonding session, a heart-to-heart. And I don't know about you, but some of the best conversations I've ever had have been while just driving around aimlessly with someone. So on the surface, I can totally understand where she could have been going with this. I mean, shit is definitely going to take a hard fucking left here in a few minutes, but at first glance, a drive and a talk, it doesn't seem like the worst idea. However, regretfully, my friends, that does bring us to January 27th, 2008. The day started off relatively normally for Karissa and her mom. Things were definitely tense, as they usually were, but the two did eat breakfast together, and Penny even later went and got Karissa Subway for lunch. Beyond that, though, it is my understanding that Karissa spent most of the rest of the day holed up alone in her room, which was fairly typical for her, as is typical for any preteen girl. Things for Penny and Karissa didn't really stray from the norm until that afternoon, right around 4 p.m. when Penny knocked on Karissa's door and she asked her if she wanted to go on the aforementioned drive. According to Penny, her thought process with this was that if she could get Karissa in the car, it might be easier to get through to her and to actually have a productive conversation with her because she couldn't storm off and slam herself alone in her room. Sure, in theory, makes sense, but again, things are really about to go off the rails here. At any rate, Karissa did begrudgingly accept this offer. Whether she had any real hopes of solving any of her and her mother's issues, I honestly couldn't tell you. I mean, there's also every chance in the world that she was just bored and wanted to get out of the house. Unfortunately, the only people who truly knew how the conversation went prior to this car ride were Penny, and the second would have been Karissa, but yeah. At any rate, the girls loaded up into Penny's red Dodge Neon, and they headed from Bridgewater to Lunenburg to a scenic little spot overlooking the ocean. According to Penny, this was where she was hoping that she and Karissa could, kind of hash out their differences. Unfortunately, though, changing the setting of the argument did not really seem to change the outcome in the way that Penny thought it might. Karissa still wasn't exactly open or receptive to the things that Penny had to say, and now, instead of being able to get away and to process her feelings, she was stuck in this tiny little pressure cooker with her mom while both of their frustrations mounted. Obviously, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that as Penny drove she and Karissa back to Bridgewater, you probably could have cut the tension in that car with a friggin' knife. Honestly, it really shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone when I tell you that when Penny stopped at a local grocery store on her way home to grab a couple of quick items, Karissa opted to stay in the car rather than to accompany her mother in. This was apparently something that she did often, even on their best days. So after a big argument and basically being told that she was being forced to go to counseling, well, it's understandable to think that Karissa might have wanted a few minutes to herself while her mom was in the store. However, the plot twist that I don't think anyone could have seen coming was that when Penny returned to the car with her juice and her bacon, Karissa was apparently gone. Now, that said, apparently Penny didn't panic right away. It could never be me, but okay. Instead, she figured that Karissa had likely gone out of the car to walk around a bit, to blow off some steam, and to just kind of cool off. So after making a quick call home to Vernon, a call that I do not believe he answered, Penny then decided to hop into her car and circle the block to see if hopefully she could find her kid. And I don't know about you, but dude, I could not imagine being that calm not knowing where your kid was. Shit, my mom was so strict about keeping my sister and I in her line of sight when we were out that even now, at my big old age of 32, if I go to the grocery store with my mom, I still keep a hand on the cart because she literally embedded that shit into my DNA. And you bet your bottom dollar, I am just as crazy with my kids. So if I came out to the car and I was down a kid, there would not be an ear in that vicinity that wouldn't be bleeding on account of the blood-curdling scream my soul would exercise. Not Penny, though. It wasn't until after she did a couple of laps around the Sobeys and still didn't catch even so much as a glimpse of Karissa that she finally drew the line and decided to reach out to the Bridgewater police in order to formally report her daughter missing. Mind you, according to the CCTV footage from the grocery store, Penny walked out with her items at 5:40 p.m. Yet, for some reason, she didn't call the police until 8:30. So almost 3 whole hours later. Oh, and then something else that I find extremely odd, and maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, so if by chance you know, please feel free to correct me, but I don't think that Penny called the emergency line. Like, I don't think she called 911. From what I was able to gather, it seems like instead she called the Bridgewater Police Department specifically. Again, maybe I'm mistaken, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I don't think that I am. Nevertheless, though, when Penny did finally get a hold of an officer, rather than simply stating, "My daughter is missing," Penny instead took it upon herself to preemptively classify her daughter herself as a runaway. Even though, from her story, she didn't know what happened to Karissa. She was operating purely on assumption. All she knew was that Karissa was in the car when she went into the store, and supposedly not when she had come back out. Any number of things could have happened to Karissa, but because Penny described the situation as a runaway child, of course police weren't going to treat the situation as anything different. So at first, after Penny filed the report, nothing all that extensive was really done. She was simply instructed to go home and to wait. She was told that more than likely, Karissa would turn up relatively quickly. In the meantime, police did instruct her to reach out to any family or friends that she could think of that Karissa might reach out to, but otherwise, that was kind of it at first. However, after a few hours without even so much as a whisper of an idea as to where Karissa could be, police did finally decide to mobilize and to head out and begin their search. And normally we're not used to police moving this quickly on a runaway case, but because a major snowstorm was forecasted to hit Nova Scotia that night, coupled with the fact that Karissa had absolutely not been dressed for the weather, police decided it was better to get moving sooner rather than later. The forecast was calling for up to 10 centimeters of snow over that night and into the following morning. And according to Penny's report, Karissa had taken off wearing just a hoodie, a vest, jeans, and Crocs. So suffice it to say that if Karissa caught herself stuck out in the rapidly approaching blizzard, if she was trying to run away or she had gotten turned around and lost or injured or something, chances were that under those circumstances, she wouldn't have made it through the night. A thought that was haunting and horrific to everyone that was out searching for her. And what was worse was that after just 30 minutes of searching, it became painfully clear to police that they might have already waited too long. By the time they got out and they got to searching, the snow had already ramped up significantly. So within 30 minutes, they were forced to halt the search and wait until things cleared up. They did manage to search a decent radius around the Sobeys where Karissa had gone missing from in that time frame. They checked the parking lot, they'd checked behind the building, dumpsters, they'd checked along a nearby riverbank, and they even went to a highway stretch where homeless people typically made up their camps during bad weather. But frustratingly, even with the help of bloodhounds brought in to hopefully track Karissa's scent, with the heavy snowfall, it wasn't happening. So, like I said, they called off their search for the night with plans to pick it back up first thing in the morning when it was safer for everyone involved. Meanwhile, back at Penny's, word had started to spread through the apartment building about Karissa's disappearance, and this actually prompted some of Penny and Vernon's neighbors to reach out, whether it was to offer words of hope and encouragement, or even some to see if there was anything tangible that they could do to help. For example, one of Penny and Vernon's neighbors came down to console Penny after finding out what was going on, and while they were talking, this neighbor graciously offered, out of the kindness of their heart, not only to make up some flyers with Karissa's picture on them, but these people offered to head out in this snowstorm at like 3 a.m. to go out and hang these posters around town. Like, that is so kind and so generous and so helpful. Just, you would think that Penny would have been so grateful that these people were willing to show up for her, but also that these people were willing to go so out of their way for her missing daughter. If your kid was missing, you would think that anything that anyone was willing to do to help put an end to that nightmare, that has to feel like the most incredible gift in the world, right? Well, I guess not to Penny, because when these neighbors offered this amazingly generous favor to Penny, she declined. Yep, her daughter was missing, with not so much as a whisper of hope of finding her so far. And people were offering to help, to spread the word in hopes of finding her. And Penny turned them away. Just, no thanks. And understandably, this really rubbed this neighbor the wrong way. as it should have. Look, I get it. I understand that you never know how someone is going to react in stressful or traumatic situations like this. But to turn down help while also not being out doing anything yourself to try to track your child down? Something ain't right there. Girl, I do not care what the weather conditions were. It could have been raining fire during a tornado in the middle of an earthquake, and I still cannot imagine not being out and searching for my missing child. And you'll see as this story goes on that this is a trend with Penny. Throughout this entire investigation, if there is one thing that you can count on Penny to do, it is to make herself look bad. Like, real bad. Like when Paul was at the apartment with everyone the day after Karissa disappeared, and he noticed that instead of appearing distraught that her daughter was missing, Penny instead was comforting and consoling Vernon. 'Cause his knee hurt. Dude, if one of my kids was missing and my husband told me that his knee hurt, I would take a golf club to both them caps, because why are you slowing me down when some insignificant bullshit like that at a time like this? But according to Paul, this was just who Penny had become over the years. She had gone from kind and bubbly and outgoing when she was with Shane to just a cold, callous, closed-off bitch. And especially since she had started dating Vernon, Paul stated that even though the relationship was fairly new, Penny pretty much from day one seemed to put her relationship with Vernon over her daughter.
Disgusting!
And yes, that is gross, but spoiler alert, Penny is gross. It was around 7 p.m. the day after Karissa's disappearance, so Monday, January 28th, when Penny was finally brought into the police station to give her first formal interview. And most of the interview just consisted of rehashing what we've already gone through as far as the events of the day leading up to Karissa's disappearance. They hung out at home, Karissa spent the day in her room, they got Subway for lunch before Penny then asked Karissa to go on that drive. And while there were no real surprises throughout that portion of Penny's interview, police were a little taken aback hearing how this woman spoke about her missing daughter. Because not only did she spend the majority of the interview almost venting about Karissa, about her behavior and her lack of respect and her moody outbursts, but there were also portions of the interview where Penny referred to Karissa as it, which is just... I know I haven't done my Dave Pelzer video yet. Don't worry, it is still coming. But if you do know that story, then you know that Penny calling Karissa it's giving Catherine Rorva. And that is absolutely not what you want to be giving at any point in time. Yikes. When asked by police who out of the adults in her life Penny believed that Karissa likely respected the most, Penny actually theorized that it was likely Shane. So her dad's brother that was also her stepfather for the bulk of her early life. According to Penny, Karissa had initially wanted to move back in with her because she wasn't happy living with Paul and his wife. However, then obviously she also wasn't happy living with Penny and Vernon. And Penny claimed that during her car conversation, she asked Karissa where she thought she would be happiest living, but Karissa just didn't have an answer. And honestly, that is so sad when you think about it. This poor girl clearly just felt like she did not belong anywhere. Like she couldn't be happy anywhere. Being a teenager is hard enough, but to feel completely unstable anywhere and everywhere that you try to call home, that had to have been so hard for her. Now, Penny wasn't necessarily a suspect in Karissa's disappearance at the time of this first formal interview. Honestly, I think at that point, everyone was still trying to hold out hope that maybe Karissa had run away and that eventually she would turn up. However, Penny was told at the end of this first interview that if Karissa did not show up back home alive and well soon, that there was a chance that they'd be calling her back in for another interview and potentially even a polygraph. Because even if she wasn't a suspect per se at the current moment, given Penny's attitude and some of her borderline inappropriate choices of words throughout her interview, police just could not help to think that something just felt off about Penny and about her story. But even so, overwhelmingly, at the beginning of the investigation, Carissa's case really did scream runaway. So police did try to hold on to that for as long as they possibly could, especially after recovering numerous diary and journal entries of Carissa's, all of which detailed how unhappy she was and how much she hated her living arrangement and how desperately she just wanted out. So at this point, I think we're like 36 hours out from the last time that Karissa was seen. It was Tuesday, January 29th, and in collaboration with the Bridgewater police, Penny decided to sit down and to participate in a press conference. During this press conference, Penny answered a couple of questions from reporters after pleading for Karissa to please either reach out or to come home. In closing, police then did their best to try and calm some of the public fear surrounding the case by sharing their theory that Carissa's disappearance was likely an isolated incident and that chances were other children of Bridgewater were not necessarily in danger. Sure, Penny's initial report to police described Karissa as a runaway, but with each hour that passed, that started to seem a lot less likely. And public interest surrounding this case, it was growing exponentially by the minute. Carissa's story was everywhere. It was on TV. It was on the radio. It was being discussed on social media. I think within like a week of Karissa going missing, there was a Facebook page totaling close to 15,000 people specifically dedicated to raising awareness for Karissa. No matter where you went or who you talked to, everyone was talking about this missing little girl. Not to mention sharing their theories on what they believed could have potentially happened to her. Because realistically, had she run away, given the extensive searches that had been performed since her disappearance, she really could have only gotten so far. So chances are that she would have been found by this point, had she really just wandered off on foot on her own accord. So if she hadn't run away, what had happened to her? Had she been kidnapped? Had she met with some sort of other foul play? Had she tried to run away and potentially ended up in the nearby La Have River? Honestly, the possibilities were endless because police, they didn't really have anything to rule out any specific scenario, much less lend credence to any one particular theory. That is until late in the afternoon on January 29th, so just after Penny's press conference. Police were just minding their business that day and doing their day-to-day work when all of a sudden a man walked into the police station and he handed them their first real lead and their first real piece of evidence. Evidently, while driving down William Hebb Road, sticking out of the snow on the shoulder, this man had managed to spot and to recover one single little pink Croc. And this shoe just so happened to be identical to the shoe that Karissa was reported to have last been seen wearing. And this was huge because, like I said, this was the first lead that had really come to them since Karissa had gone missing. This was the first real, tangible piece of evidence that they could actually hold in their hands. So, obviously, police immediately made their way out to the stretch of road where the man had claimed to have found the shoe because they were hoping that they could find more potential evidence. However, frustratingly, after meticulously combing through the area with professional searchers as well as tracking dogs, police walked away with nothing more than that one single pink Croc. So, considering that this was the only piece of evidence that they had, they sent the shoe off for forensic testing to confirm with 100% certainty that that shoe had in fact been Carissa's. And while they waited for the results, they decided to keep the fact that the shoe had been recovered out of the media. Because like I've said a million times, this was the only piece of evidence they had. So not only did they want to protect the integrity of their investigation, but they also wanted to hold that piece of evidence in case they needed to use it later to vet out any future statements or possible confessions. Because at this point, foul play wasn't just in the back of the minds of investigators, it was kind of starting to become like the only realistic explanation for Carissa's disappearance. So slowly but surely, the investigation techniques they were using shifted from missing persons to kidnap and or homicide. And based on the weirdness that they had witnessed up to this point, police, understandably, really started to focus their investigation in on none other than Penny and Vernon. They called Penny in for a second formal interview, and throughout the course of said second interview, Penny, she didn't make herself look any better. Rather than asking for any updates or seeing if there was anything else that she could do to help, Penny instead spent the bulk of the interview painting Karissa out to be just this miserable, horrible, awful child. She basically told police that living with Karissa was like living with a bomb. She and Vernon were constantly walking on eggshells and always just wondering and fearing when Carissa's next outburst might be. The only time that she seemed to show any sadness or desperation for her daughter was when she was left alone in the interview rooms. That was when she would cry and break down and speak to Karissa and beg her to come home. And I'm putting mad attitude on that because objectively, this was 1,000,000% performative. You'll see why in a little bit, but yeah, just know that these crocodile tears, they were nothing more than an act put on to make police think that she actually gave a rat's ass about the safety of her daughter, which she unequivocally did not. Vernon, on the other hand, when he was called in for his formal interview, he actually genuinely seemed saddened and upset by Carissa's disappearance. Actually, he was really upset over the possibility that had he maybe gone with the girls on their drive, perhaps Karissa wouldn't be missing now. He told police that he and Karissa never really had any problems with one another, and that it was Karissa and Penny that had the contentious relationship. And that was actually why he hadn't pushed to go on the drive with them. He figured that the two of them needed some alone time to try to work through their issues together. When asked to walk police through the day of Carissa's disappearance from his perspective, Vernon explained the day leading up to the drive pretty much identically to the way that Penny had. They all woke up, they had breakfast, and Karissa spent the day in her room until around 4 o'clock when she and Penny left for their drive. However, then once he was alone in the apartment, Vernon had a beer before he laid down to take a nap. And that's actually why he didn't answer the phone when Penny had called him after she left Sobeys. He said that he did hear the phone ring a couple of times, but that he never bothered to get up to answer it. So basically, he slept the entire time from when Karissa and Penny left the apartment to the time that Penny frantically returned home, telling him that Karissa was missing. And when police asked Vernon what should be done to the responsible party, had someone in fact hurt Karissa, Vernon told police that if someone was capable of hurting a child, that they had no business walking among the living, if you catch my drift. And then, prior to the conclusion of the interview, Vernon told police that if they needed anything else from him, be it additional interviews, forensic samples, a polygraph, whatever, he was more than willing to provide it to them. And while both Penny and Vernon's interviews were quite telling, each for their own specific reasons, police still, in the grand scheme of things, they did not have anything to go on when it came to actually investigating what was going on or to actually finding Karissa. So on February 1st, out of sheer desperation to keep the investigation from stalling out, police decided to hold yet another press conference in hopes of sparking up more tips or more leads from the public. It had been almost a week since Karissa had disappeared, and as we know, as time wore on, the chances of bringing Karissa home alive were rapidly dwindling. Yet even with that fact, during this press conference, spectators they could not help but notice that Penny just did not seem at all upset about her missing child. And honestly, police really tried not to publicly incriminate Penny and Vernon. But regardless of that, public speculation and rumors still ran rampant through Bridgewater that they had to have had something to do with Carissa's disappearance, especially considering Penny's seemingly nonchalant attitude towards the whole situation. And sure, in one single isolated setting, one could argue that maybe she was just depleted. Maybe she was numb. She was disassociating. Whatever. But for starters, this already isn't the only time that Penny seemed to not care about her missing daughter. Even when people would approach her out and about and they would try to offer their sympathies to her, most of them would tell you the same thing about their interactions with her. She just did not seem all that upset. If anything, she seemed more apathetic. Sure, she wasn't outwardly excited or happy, but she just also didn't seem that sad. And obviously a lot of this is subjective based off of people's opinions on how they believed that someone should be acting in Penny's position. But I don't know, man. When enough people start to share the same sentiment, in my opinion, it starts to hold a little more merit. You know, truly, the public in general seemed much more invested and seemed to care much more about finding answers about what had happened to this little girl than her own mother did. Little did they know that those answers were right around the corner. And sadly, they were absolutely not going to be the answers they were hoping for. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, the pieces of the devastating puzzle of what really happened to Karissa Boudreau, they finally start to fall into place. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and jump right back in to where we left off. So it's now February 9th. Karissa had been missing for closing in on 2 weeks now, and whether or not anyone wanted to admit it out loud, most people really weren't expecting a happy ending to this story anymore. Sure, they were still desperately hoping for one. I mean, we've seen these stories turn out positively after months, years, decades, but those examples are definitely the exception to the rule. At any rate, though, it was just after 11 a.m. on February 9th, 2008, when a woman pulled off of the side of Route 331. This certainly wasn't a scheduled stop in her morning drive. However, it became a necessary one when her son, he just couldn't hold it anymore. I guess Lil Homie absolutely had to pee. So she pulled over, he hopped out of the car, and he proceeded to walk a little ways away from the roadway so that he wouldn't be on display while he did his business. Terrifyingly though, just as this poor kid got near the edge of the riverbank, something caught his eye. And as he walked closer and closer to try to figure out what exactly he was looking at, all of a sudden it hit him like a ton of bricks. What he was looking at was a frozen solid set of human toes sticking up out of the snow. Obviously horrified, this kid hauled ass back to his mom's car, and he frantically began trying to explain to her what he thought he saw. And what's really crazy that came out later is that apparently you could only really see these toes from a very specific angle when you were walking towards them. So the fact that this young man who was just rushing in because he had to pee, the fact that he managed to approach in just perfectly to discover this body, I mean, of course it's horrible for him, and I hope he's okay after all of this, but it's almost like the body was meant to be found that day, right? He could have so easily missed the toes, ran back, taken his leak, and then left, making it so that who knows if or when this body would have been discovered after that. But somehow, some way, that didn't happen, and he did manage to see them. And after hearing this story, the boy's mom frantically flagged down the next passing vehicle she saw, and together the two adults called the police. The call came into the Bridgewater Police Department just after 11:30 a.m., and my guess would be that police were on the scene likely before noon. By this point, they had also notified the RCMP, who joined them on the scene as they cordoned off the area. They also, rightfully, closed off a big chunk of that road that the boy and his mom had been driving on, just to make for 100% certain that no one could interfere with their investigation. Now, of course, any time that a major road is closed down like that, especially coupled with heavy police presence, it's gonna get people talking. And this scenario was no different. It did not take long for word to start to spread that police had potentially found a body. Then, given that Karissa's story had completely consumed Bridgewater by this point, well, let's just say it did not take people long to make the connection that this was more than likely Karissa that police had found. Now, that said, police had not even publicly announced that they had found a body, let alone had time to definitively confirm whether or not it was Karissa. But because gossip tends to move faster than forensics, the first that Penny heard of police potentially having found her daughter was actually from a convenience store clerk when she stopped to buy cigarettes that afternoon. And while the clerk was horrified to learn that she was the one informing Penny that police may have found her dead daughter, once again, Penny, on the other hand, she just didn't seem to care. This girl was apologizing to her profusely for accidentally being so callous, to which Penny simply responded that it was fine, that she just needed to get home now in case anyone needed to contact her. Girl, what? If I would have heard that, home would have been the last place I would have been heading. I'd have trekked my ass straight to the scene and torn through that police tape with my teeth if I thought it meant getting to my child. Not Penny, though. Nope. She's just like, oh drat, guess I better hurry home to make sure I don't miss any correspondence. She wasn't even kind of trying to act like she might be sad. Absolutely wild. Now, initially, because the body had clearly been exposed to the elements for a while, police weren't able to definitively say right away whether or not the body was Karissa. Of course, the general consensus was that it probably was. It was a Caucasian girl, 5 foot, give or take, with long brown hair, which, I mean, pretty much fits Karissa's description to a T. What was very disturbing to police, though, was that whether this was Karissa or not, upon first look, it looked like the murder might have been sexually motivated, which is just vile. The body was still partially clothed. However, her shirt was pushed up, exposing her midriff, and her jeans and underpants had been partially pulled down. So it definitely wasn't looking good. A preliminary examination at the scene revealed ligature marks around the girl's neck, which indicated strangulation as her cause of death. That said, though, although she had been found where she had, along that stretch of highway by the riverbank, police were pretty quick to theorize that, given the lack of a sign of struggle at the scene, that this girl was likely killed somewhere else prior to having been dumped at that location post-mortem. Ultimately, an autopsy of this body would later conclusively identify it as that of 12-year-old Karissa, and this was confirmed via dental records obtained from Karissa's dentist. Her autopsy also confirmed that strangulation was her cause of death, with her manner of death clearly being homicide. Interestingly, though, despite Karissa's clothes being disheveled and partially removed upon her discovery, a thorough forensic examination actually completely ruled out any sort of sexual component in Karissa's murder. Meanwhile, back at Penny and Vernon's apartment, police had really started to ramp up their investigation into the couple, given the discovery of Karissa's body. Actually, the RCMP ordered 24-hour surveillance on Vernon and Penny's apartment. And that actually might have been done before they even discovered Karissa's body, but don't quote me on that. Regardless, though, police were now watching Penny and Vernon like hawks, day in and day out, around the clock. And you'd think that'd be beneficial, but they were not getting anything incriminating on them to help push their investigation forward. Little did they know, though, that thankfully they were not the only ones on 24-hour surveillance duty in that apartment. You see, these buildings weren't exactly luxury apartments by any means. So the walls in this place were thin. Thin. Cannot relate. In all seriousness, though, this was actually one of the things that Karissa hated about living in this apartment. The walls in their place were so thin that she could hear everything that went on in that apartment. From fights to conversations, right down to any time that Penny and Vernon decided to slap their meats together, which just has to be so traumatizing for a 12-year-old girl. Ew. But while it was horrific for Karissa that the apartment walls were so thin, for the investigation, on the other hand, well, in that regard, it actually ended up being incredibly beneficial. Starting with a report to police from a concerned neighbor who just so happened to hear a very interesting fight between Vernon and Penny very shortly after Karissa's body had been discovered. Now, we don't know everything that was said during this fight. However, the gist of the argument was basically a drunken Vernon laying the fuck in to Penny. He was throwing things around the apartment. He was yelling at her that he was leaving her and that she disgusted him. And that was in between repeated pleas asking her how she could have done this. Now, sure, he didn't specifically say, how could you do this to Karissa? Nothing like that. But given all that was going on at the time and the mounting suspicion that police were already feeling towards Penny, I guess I'll just say that it's not really hard to understand why the report of this fight prompted police to bring Vernon back in for another conversation. Unfortunately, though, due to the fact that Vernon was 3 sheets to the freaking wind at the time, this conversation really didn't end up being all that productive. Mostly he just spent the time crying over either potentially losing Penny or wishing that there was something he could do to help Karissa. Meanwhile, with Vernon, now isolated from Penny for the time being, police also decided to re-engage with her and to see if perhaps she wouldn't mind physically walking them through the events that led up to Karissa's disappearance. She agreed to do this, and so for the next few hours, she took them point by point and place by place through the entire route that she had driven with Karissa before ending up at the Sobeys. And while everything about her physical movements did seem to match up with the story that she'd been giving police the whole time, what inevitably, once again, stuck out to them above anything else was how emotionless Penny was. Whether it was retracing the very last steps she ever took with her daughter, or her walking past literal posters and photos of Karissa, never once throughout this entire outing did Penny ever, at any point, even look like she might be on the cusp of getting emotional. It was as if she was retracing her steps to find lost keys or something. Like, at this point, we've passed suspicious and eyebrow raising, and we gotta be heading straight towards downright sociopathic, right? I mean, obviously, that's just my opinion, but come on, can't you even pretend to show some emotion, you robot? At this point in time, this woman was still waiting to find out if the dead body found alongside the highway was her daughter or not. And yet she showed no emotion walking past actual photos of her missing kid. Not only that, she didn't show interest in the case. She didn't ask for updates. She didn't ask for an ETA on the identification. She was giving police nothing. And still, yet again, police were forced to just send her back home because apparently no matter what they tried, they just could not seem to get this woman to slip up and to incriminate herself. So thank God for her neighbors, because they were catching and reporting way shadier things to police than police were even close to managing to trudge up themselves. So on a completely separate night from the fight where Vernon told Penny that she disgusted him, a different neighbor heard Vernon on the phone with someone telling them that he needed to get out of here because she fucking did it. She killed her kid. Yeah, that was much less ambiguous than what the last neighbor heard. That's pretty black and white. Not a lot of room for interpretation there. Obviously, this neighbor reported this to police, which finally gave them enough to get a search warrant for both Penny's car as well as her and Vernon's apartment. Oh, and they also went ahead and took them into custody at this point because, especially now, they had no reason to believe anything other than the fact that either Penny or Vernon or both were responsible for what had happened to Karissa. And it was actually while in custody at the station that police finally informed both Penny and Vernon that the body that had been found had been conclusively identified as Karissa. And what do you think Penny's reaction was to hearing this? To hearing that her daughter was never coming home. To finding out that her daughter was dead. That she had been strangled to death and then dumped on the side of the highway like a piece of trash. You think she cried? You think she broke down? You think maybe all of the emotion that she'd been holding in up to this point finally bubbled over the surface? Hope not, because if you were thinking that was the case, you are going to be sorely disappointed. Because after hearing definitively that her daughter was gone and that she was never coming back, Penny simply just asked to speak to a lawyer. She didn't ask how Karissa died. She didn't ask if they were sure it was her body. She didn't so much as shed a tear or even bother to deny any involvement in what had happened to her. She just sat there, stone-faced, and demanded to speak to her lawyer. And unfortunately, in the next room, Vernon wasn't really giving police anything to work with either. Not even one single time through hours of interrogation did Vernon even remotely implicate either himself or Penny in Karissa's murder. Even when they placed both Penny and Vernon in cells with undercover officers trained to elicit information out of suspects, still bupkis. Although Vernon in particular did get pretty buddy-buddy with his undercover officer, but beyond that, police actually ended up having to release the couple after just 24 hours because they still had nothing to truly hold them on. All they had really found from the searches of the car and the apartment were some letters that Penny had written to Vernon, flat out telling him that she valued her relationship with him over her relationship with Karissa.
I don't like that.
Nevertheless, though, just before 10 a.m. on February 15th, 2008, Penny and Vernon were cut loose, just in time to head out for a late little Valentine's Day celebration. To be clear, I don't know that they actually did that, by the way. That was just me being like a quirky bitch. 4 days after Penny and Vernon were released from custody on February 19th, Karissa's body was laid to rest in Oakvale Cemetery. Hundreds of people turned out to the church to mourn and to pay their final respects to Karissa. In fact, so many people showed up for that little girl that they couldn't even all fit in the church at one time. Hundreds of them were forced to mourn outside as people shared words and memories, and as the church sound system echoed Bubbly by Colby Calais. Karissa had loved that song ever since it was released the previous year, and she even had started referring to it as her happy song. Karissa had been really active in her church, not to mention that Bridgewater as a whole had kind of adopted her as their daughter. So this service was really, really difficult for everyone who attended. Everyone, that is, except for Penny. Although she and Vernon were in attendance, they sat alone, and they did not speak to anyone before they eventually just snuck out unnoticed. Penny could not even so much as offer a single thank you to one person who had shown up to pay their respects to her daughter. Like, are you guys hating this woman yet? Because police definitely were. They were so desperate to solve this case and to avenge Karissa and to get this woman behind bars that they decided to employ a very controversial investigative procedure known as a Mr. Big Sting.
You know what your nickname is, Mr. Big.
Simply put, a Mr. Big Sting is a covert investigation procedure used by undercover police to elicit confessions from suspects, typically in murder investigations. So in a Mr. Big Sting, police create these fake crime syndicates, and they try to get their suspects to join the organization to build a relationship with them. They gain their confidence, they gain their trust, and then they start to enlist them in progressively more serious criminal acts. Think delivering stolen goods, credit card scams, selling and transporting weapons, the huge. The suspects then receive payment for these services, and they eventually get fully enmeshed into the gangs. Then, once the suspect feels like they're really a part of this operation, the undercover officers then try to persuade them to give up information about their criminal history as well as the crime that they're suspected of. And this is usually presented as an official initiation into this gang or crime family or what have you. And like I said, the practice as a whole, mad controversial. I mean, inherently, given the nature of it, it just runs the risk of being seen as coercive. And that's not to mention that confessions given under these circumstances could potentially be viewed as unreliable. Because these suspects are trying to gain street cred with people that they believe to be criminals. So even if they do confess to something, who's to say that that confession is actually legitimate, right? And those are just some of the issues that come along with a Mr. Big Sting. There's also fears that it could prejudice a jury and just a general feeling that the whole practice is unethical. Actually, it's illegal in a lot of places. It's illegal in the US, which honestly is shocking because I feel like this is some shit we would love down here in America, but I guess not. Apparently there's lines that even we won't cross. Who'd have thought? Meanwhile, as police were meticulously planning the ins and out of their Mr. Big Sting against Penny and Vernon, completely out of left field, they actually had another massive breakthrough in the case fall right into their laps. Once again, this happened to come at the hands of a completely random and unsuspecting citizen. It was February 25th, so almost a month to the day from when Karissa had disappeared, when a man who was looking for recyclables at a local playground stumbled across what appeared to be a pink crock in one of the trash cans. Now, obviously, Karissa's case was still all that anyone could talk about, and knowing that she had last been seen wearing pink Crocs, this discovery prompted the man to reach out to the Bridgewater police to report what he had seen. When compared to the original pink Croc they'd found, it was determined to be a match, and then DNA testing would later prove the shoes to have definitively been Karissa's. Police had also recovered a black hoodie and a black vest from the same trash can, both consistent with the ones that Karissa was reported to have been wearing when she disappeared. So I don't think it was any big shock for police when the DNA results did come back. I think by that point it was more of a formality than anything. Now, ironically, depending on how you want to look at it, the same day that Karissa's clothing was recovered from the playground trash can, Miss Penny, well, she tried to take a one-way pill-induced ride straight up out this life. Big fat bummer for her, though. I guess first responders arrived just in time to get her to the hospital, where doctors ultimately were able to save her life. So I guess, yay. And while Penny was apparently drowning her sorrows and guilt in prescription pills, her old pal Vernon had instead turned to the sauce to quelch his stress. Yeah, homeboy was drinking and pretty much round the clock, day in and day out. His schedule at the liquor store had actually become so predictable that was where police finally decided to deploy the beginnings of their Mr. Big sting. Knowing that Vernon would eventually be heading to the liquor store at some point, police planted the same undercover officer there that had been planted in his holding cell back when he'd been detained on the 14th. And apparently, Vernon had enjoyed his conversation with this man so much that when he noticed him at the liquor store, he hesitated 0% in approaching him and striking up yet another conversation with him. He quite literally played directly into police's hands, just as they had suspected he would. He and the undercover officer exchanged phone numbers, and within 24 hours, Vernon had made contact with him again, inquiring about any potential work that he might have for him. You know, nefarious work, criminal work. And given that that is quite literally the entire purpose of a Mr. Big sting, of course, the undercover officer was very much willing to put Vernon in touch with his boss. And over the next 3 months, Vernon found himself working constantly with this crime boss. As the story went, this man was a mobster in charge of the East Coast operations for a gang that was based in Montreal. And in Vernon's eyes, this man was just the cat's pajamas. He had money, he had cars, he was obviously very powerful, and Vernon, he was just eating that shit up. Whatever jobs this man offered to him, Vernon was ready and willing to complete. He was eager to do anything that he possibly could to work his way up the ranks and to start earning more money within this organization. Poor Vernon, he felt so close to this man the more that they worked together that he eventually told him that he was one of the very few people in the world that he felt like he could trust anymore. And honestly, I feel conflicted about this because, spoiler alert, Vernon's innocent. So low-key, it's kind of sad that Penny had his life so twisted up and broken down that he didn't feel like he could trust anyone. And then along comes this one person that he does feel like he can trust. And secretly, this guy is like basically trying to entrap him into a murder confession. I know he has some less than desirable qualities, but overall, I genuinely do feel bad for how a lot of this played out for Vernon. Penny, on the other hand, I have no sympathy for that wretched bitch. Now, she wasn't really involved in the Mr. Big sting, at least not at the beginning. However, after months and months of getting nowhere with Vernon, as far as information surrounding Karissa went, the Mr. Big operatives decided to kind of coax the investigation in the direction that they needed it to go. I believe it was May 1st, 2008, when the organization propositioned Vernon with a job. However, in order to complete this job, he evidently was going to need a female counterpart. Enter Penny. Now, Penny wasn't immediately as eager to join up with this, cut-rate mob boss. However, after a few days of begging, Vernon convinced Penny to go ahead and go along with the plan. After all, their relationship had really been struggling in the preceding months, and if there is one thing Penny gonna do, it is whatever she gots to do to keep her mans. And so Vernon took Penny and he introduced her to Mr. Big himself. I believe the meeting took place at the Radisson Hotel in Halifax, all while a whole fleet of separate officers listened in and watched the meeting from an adjoining room. After introductions, the man explained to Penny that before he could bring her into their operation, he needed to know everything that there was to know about her. He told her nothing was off limits and that he could even maybe help her if need be, but that he could not do anything for her if she wasn't completely honest with him. And then, right there, with, I'd say very little effort, Penny began confessing what had really happened to Karissa. She told Mr. Big that she was so inexplicably and desperately in love with Vernon that there was not anything she would not do to keep him. So when he had given her an ultimatum, telling her that she had to choose either him or Karissa, well, for Penny, it was a no-brainer. In her own words, the thought of losing Vernon to her was much more upsetting than the thought of losing her own daughter. And so, after contemplating for a few days, Penny decided that Karissa had to go. Now, the little drive and the heart-to-heart that Penny claimed she wanted to have with Karissa, that all really did happen, but where Penny's original story differs from reality was everything that she claimed happened after she left the Sobeys from picking up her juice and bacon. Karissa, had not disappeared from the car while Penny was in the store. She was still sitting right in Penny's Neon's passenger seat where she had left her when she came out of Sobeys. In fact, Karissa was present and accounted for, alive and well, when Penny called Vernon at the apartment to try to tell him that Karissa was gone. Once Penny came back out to the car, she placed her groceries in the trunk. However, before she closed it, she retrieved a piece of twine that she'd hidden there earlier, and she placed it in her jacket pocket. She then drove her daughter to a dark, quiet area on William Hebb Road before telling Karissa to get out of the car. It was dark and cold and snowing as Penny tackled her very own daughter to the ground. She dug her knee into her chest while looking in her eyes as she wrapped that twine around her neck. And the last words that Karissa managed to get out before Penny pulled the twine taut, "Mommy, don't." But no matter how impassioned the plea, I don't think it would have mattered. Penny had already made up her mind that evening to get rid of her daughter, and I just don't think that anything that Karissa could have said would have changed her mind. And with that, Penny pulled the twine as tightly as she could around Carissa's throat, and she just watched as Karissa struggled to breathe. Karissa was desperate. Her eyes were bulging. Her tongue was protruding from between her teeth. And eventually she started to foam at the mouth. Yeah, she tried to get free. She fought for her life, but ultimately with her knee in Carissa's chest, Penny simply had the upper hand. And she held her daughter there like that, twine around her neck, struggling for air until she had squeezed every ounce of life out of Carissa's body. She then lifted her up and placed her in the back of the car before driving her to the area that her body would ultimately be discovered. She drug her from the car towards the riverbank, and noticing that while she was moving Karissa, her clothing was becoming disheveled, Penny actually thought that she had caught a lucky break with this, because Carissa's clothing being amiss might lead people to think that she had been sexually assaulted, therefore hopefully taking the suspicion off of her if and when Karissa was found. Can you think of anything more depraved? To be thankful that you're leaving your dead daughter exposed like this, because maybe it'll make people think she was raped and in turn take the heat off of you. Absolutely vile, this woman. Just diabolical. Ugh. And then before she rolled Carissa's body down the embankment, Penny removed her hoodie and her vest as well as her one remaining crock. And she then doubled back and disposed of all of that at the playground where the guy later found it. Mind you, Penny is just sitting here casually telling this guy, who she thinks is a mob boss, all of this. And she wasn't even emotional as she was recounting it. If anything, she almost seemed proud of it. She seemed excited to finally be sharing it with someone. Meanwhile, the police in the other room, while ecstatic to know that they had this bitch nailed to the wall finally, it was absolutely heartbreaking for them to hear all of this. Not only did Karissa suffer a horrific and terrifying death, but to think of the betrayal and the heartbreak that she felt, knowing that she was dying at the hands of the one woman whose job it was to protect her at all costs. It was just absolutely heart-wrenching for these poor officers. Shit, it's heart-wrenching for me to relay it to you here today, so I can't even imagine sitting there and listening to it firsthand. Personally, I commend them for not rushing into the room right then and there and doing the same shit to Penny that she had done to Karissa, although I'm sure that more than one of them wanted to. Penny was obviously subsequently arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder, which she had the fucking audacity to plead not guilty to, ultimately forcing the rest of Carissa's family to have to sit through a heartbreaking trial. 'Cause she's selfish. Penny's trial began on January 30th, 2009, so just over a year to the day that Karissa had been killed. However, before the trial could actually commence, Penny's lawyer shocked everyone by announcing that his client had actually decided to go ahead and plead guilty to the lesser offense of second-degree murder. And the judge did honor this request, which I have to say is more than I probably would have done. You had the opportunity to plead guilty at your arraignment, but instead you put all of us through this trial prep. If I were her judge, I would have been like, no ma'am. You wanted us here, you wanted a trial, so look around. You got one. Obviously, Penny fared way better by pleading down to second-degree murder rather than letting a jury inevitably find her guilty of first degree. I'm just saying, I don't understand why she put everyone through the theatrics of thinking that they were going to have to go to trial, only to then plead guilty at the 11th hour when she could have done so months before. stupid. When asked if she had anything additional that she'd like to say to the court, Penny could not muster up anything beyond a simple "I'm sorry" before she sat her worthless ass back down. Thankfully, though, Judge Stewart had much more on her mind than that she wanted to share. With disgust in her voice, Judge Stewart looked at Penny right in her beady little eyes, and she stated, quote, "Surely, Penny Boudreau, you can never call yourself mother again in conjunction with Carissa's name. The words, 'Mommy don't,' from your trusting and loving Karissa are there to haunt you for the rest of your natural life." And I could not agree more. This woman is not a mother. She was a selfish bitch out for nothing other than her own selfish desires. Even if those desires came at the expense of her own daughter's life, she didn't care. After reading her to filth, Judge Stewart then instructed Penny to stand before handing down her sentence of life in prison. Her sentence did carry parole eligibility. However, she would have to serve a minimum of 20 years before she would be eligible for consideration. So, given when she was arrested, she won't be eligible for full parole until June 14th, 2028. Yeah, notice I said full parole. Hold on to your butts for this one. While she's not up for full parole until 2028, thanks to the faint hope clause, Penny was able to apply for limited parole after just 15 years. Now, we covered the faint hope clause a while back when I covered the murder of Bruce Furman, but that was almost 3 years ago at this point. So just a refresher, the faint hope clause is a provision in the Canadian Criminal Code that allows prisoners sentenced to life in prison to apply for early parole after serving 15 years. So grotesquely, Penny would have been eligible for early parole back in 2023. And while she wasn't granted it, she has been granted numerous outings in recent years in order to see family or to attend church events. As of April 2024, the Parole Board of Canada approved 23 supervised temporary absences for Penny, 18 of which would be to participate in church-related activities, and these outings would be at a maximum of 4 hours each. She was then granted 4 7-hour absences to be used to spend time with family, and then the final absence was granted to visit a potential halfway house where she may want to live if and when she's released from prison. According to the parole board, Penny has improved significantly as a person over the course of her incarceration. I doubt it, but who am I? Penny claims that at the time of Carissa's murder, she was struggling a lot to feel a maternal connection to her, and she attributes this to having lost her own mother to suicide at a young age. Although Penny is supposedly born again and rehabilitated and such, there has still been massive public outrage surrounding her rapidly expanding freedoms, especially coming from other members of Carissa's family. They cannot believe that Penny is being allowed out at all, whether it's for church or what. They don't care. I mean, to be fair, if anyone needs Jesus, it's that miserable bitch, but don't they have chapels in jail? Why she gotta leave the premises to talk to God? Ain't he everywhere?
She's not a Christian!
During an interview with Crime Beat, Carissa's father, Paul, when asked about Penny's freedoms, stated, quote, "I want her to look me in the eye and tell me that she's rehabilitated and that she should be out starting life over again. If she can give me one good reason why she thinks that should happen and why she should be out, I won't argue, but I guarantee you that's not going to happen." At any rate, Penny will be up for full parole in just about 3.5 years. So chances are, whether we like it or not, she is going to be walking among us free folk sooner rather than later. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to poor Karissa. She should have had so much life still left to live, and she just never got the chance, all because of her mother. The one woman that was supposed to protect her at all costs cared more about her boyfriend than she did her own child. Sure, Karissa had a rebellious streak, but all in all, she was a sweet, caring, normal little girl. She loved music and teddy bears, video games, and stuffed animals. She also loved real animals and likely would have grown up to study veterinary medicine had she had the opportunity. She would be 29 years old today, and unfortunately, we will never know what good she could have done for the world had she had the chance to grow up. However, that is not to say that she has not had a positive impact on the world, because the opposite is actually true. Following the discovery of Carissa's body, a memorial was erected on the side of the highway where she was found, and as word spread that the memorial was there, hundreds of people started leaving teddy bears at the memorial in order to honor Karissa. Eventually, those bears were then collected from the memorial, cleaned, and donated to trauma victims in Carissa's honor. Upwards of 1,000 of them, which is just absolutely incredible. So certainly she did still make a massive difference in the lives of so many people. It's just a shame that she had to do it posthumously rather than alive and face to face. Dude, there is just no crime, in my opinion, more egregious than a parent taking the life of their own child. Like, I genuinely cannot think of a greater betrayal in the world than creating life just to snuff it out later. To look into your child's eyes and squeeze the life out of them after hearing them beg you not to. Dude, I'm sorry, Penny should be under the prison. I agree with Vernon. If you can hurt a kid, then you've done worn out your welcome here. That's for sure. Speaking of Vernon, like I said, he was completely cleared of having anything to do with Carissa's death. Obviously, he ended things with Penny as soon as she was arrested, and to my knowledge, she hasn't had any contact with her since. In recent interviews, he's denied having ever given Penny an ultimatum to choose between he and Carissa. Rather, he claims that all he told Penny was that something had to give. As in, like, she and Carissa couldn't keep living at each other's throats like they were. He just figured she was gonna take Carissa to counseling or something. Like, never in a million years could he have imagined that Penny was going to kill her own daughter just to try to protect her relationship with him. Again, Vernon definitely made some questionable moves throughout this story, but overall, hearing him speak in interviews, he really does seem completely gutted by what happened to Carissa, and I genuinely believe that he feels guilty for whatever role Penny believes in her mind that he played in how all of this went down. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. And of course, one more big thank you goes out to Kate for requesting this one. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the information and the links for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be here on the screen for you. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! We first have to take a little trip. With a population of just didn't really stray from the norm until I would take a golf club way, and that you bitch. But before we get into that, frantically flag the offers and Dianette, what thing at least. She is going to be walking among I don't know why she put everyone through. Don't they have chapel? I'm drooling. I have linked down in my description how